How's it going, guys? In this video, I'm going to go over a few synths from XYZ. I was working on F and Pig, but I just can't get it quite there yet. A lot of the synths are there, but I just didn't feel like it was ready for a video. So a few people have been asking me about some synths from the remake I just did for XYZ. So I thought in this one I could go over some of the plucks and maybe the Reese and the bass pluck. So this is just from the break section. I'll just let it play and then we can start going through how I made these sounds. Yeah, so that is pretty much what it sounds like. So I guess we can go through the plucks first. And the way I did the plucks is, I think there was two different pluck layers. You can hear that the first one is this kind of slow attack pluck, kind of sounds like a horn. And then later he layers it with a very attacky, distorted pluck. And that just kind of creates this very powerful, full, sharp pluck in the drop. So the first sound sounds like this. And then that is layered with this pluck. So I'll go through this first one. If you'd want to know the MIDI, so starts here. This is the next phrase. Phrase after that. There we go. I think this is the last one, maybe, or no, just a few more. Okay. So I will take off processing and then go through it. Okay, so with just a saw wave and 5 voices, it sounds like this. And right now I have envelope 2 on the level. So we're getting that pluck sound kind of, and the attack is shaped like this. So that gives us that kind of horn sound. So it's very bright already, which is what we want. Next thing I did is I threw on some hyperdimension. Like I've said in previous videos, I like to mix some of the hyper unison with just the regular oscillator unison. I think it gives it like a different flavor. So that sounds like this. It's subtle, but I think it sounds good. And then I threw on some chorus, which is just giving it another little bit of flavor. And then I have this filter, and that envelope 2 is on the cutoff as well. So that gives us more of that defined shape of the pluck, because the high frequencies are coming in a very deliberate way. And then next, I use this stomp box because it sounded like the plucks were pretty distorted. There's like the sizzle in the high end. I found that stomp box worked well. Just feels a little bit more distorted. It feels like, I don't know, there's just like some weight in there. For this EQ, I think I was taking some highs out before the compressor, because what's happening with the compressor is it's clamping down on the sound, but there's some attack of the sound that is missed by the compressor, and the beginning of the sound is like high frequency. So I didn't want that high frequency to be too sharp. Basically, what I was doing is controlling the high frequencies that are going into the compressor before the compressor, so they're not too sharp after the compressor, if that makes sense. Like if I take this off, it's way higher with without that EQ. And when I was getting into the mix of things, it was just like hurting the ear. It was like too sharp. So yeah, that is that for envelopes and everything. I think next thing I did is just some EQ, taking out some of that low rumble that distortion carried, and then raising the highs just a bit again, rolling off some of the very highs. So it feels more controlled and it's more of a high-end sound. And then this limiter is just taking off some of those very sharp peaks that the compressor would miss. And that's again just to kind of help it as it's going into mixing and mastering. So yeah, that is that sound. I did some stuff on the group, but I can go over that afterwards. And then we have this big reverb that I'll go over as well. So for the second pluck, same MIDI, but I will take off the processing again. So basically the same patch, except for this one, the envelope is a very distinct pluck sound. There's no attack, so it's very sharp. So next thing, again, hyperdimension, chorus, and then that filter with that envelope 2 as well. And this is giving us that very sharp pluck sound. Stomp box again for some distortion. Oh, another thing, this envelope 1 is also on the cutoff, and that's giving it just a little bit of a sharper attack at the very start. So it's kind of like this envelope combined with this envelope, which is a lot faster, gives it more of an attack. Again, compressor, and then I threw on some reverb in the synth. And you can hear how the compressor really makes it sharp. The attack is open like 5 milliseconds, so the first 5 milliseconds of the sound is getting through, and then it's clamping down, which is emphasizing that first 5 milliseconds, so it's even sharper. And then yeah, that reverb, same thing here. I'm doing some EQ just to make it more of a high-end sound, and I think I boosted it in a little bit of a different area than the first pluck, because these are combining to make one sound. So I kind of filled in the gaps from one that the other one didn't have. Again, just a limiter. And that's pushing it pretty hard just to keep it sharp, but also not too sharp so it doesn't hurt your ears. So yeah, those two combine to make this one pluck sound. Each by themselves. Okay, so I just had to delete some tracks because CPU is overloading. My computer sucks. So for the group, I threw on some isotope trash. And what I'm doing here is I'm kind of adding some high-end sizzle over the top of the entire thing, just trying to distort that high-end so it's even more distinguished. So it just feels much brighter, much more in your face. And then this EQ, again, rolling off some of the low end that distortion might have added. And then I have this like dynamic EQ bump here. In this like 2K to 3K region, it's kind of like the bite of a sound, or like what you feel as the slap in your ear. Same for kicks. I found that like that area, like if you boost that or attenuate that, it determines like how much that kicks like slap in your ear in the high end. So I wanted this to slap a little harder. Next thing that I did, I have this MSED, and it's a free plugin for mid side. And all I did was I was increasing the mid gain. And all I did is I was decreasing the mid gain right here and increasing the side just a little bit, because in deadmau5's song, when I referenced it, the sides were much more powerful. So I was trying to get the mids a little lower, make the sides a little louder. Just a spacing technique. And then this delay is for both of the plucks, and it's on the 3 setting, very high up. So it's just throwing it a little bit of delay in the high ends. And I wish I would have thrown the feedback a little stronger, or the dry wet just a little stronger, because I think that what you want to do is you want to have, well, at least for something like this, you want to have the delay of these plucks to kind of just be tailing off before the next ones. And that kind of makes it feel like that same frequency area is still being filled over time. Yeah. And then the next thing is both of these plucks are being sent to this reverb return track. So if I play just the return, so it's like this massive reverb. What I did is I threw on a reverb, like half wet, and then I threw on this other super massive thing, which is kind of like a delay and reverb. So it's just making it even more massive. Then I have this saturator, which is brightening up the reverb itself. I'm EQing the reverb. This trash is also brightening up that high end a little bit. Same kind of distortion. Then this utility, I'm bringing it a little bit more in the center. And I was doing some like mid-side stuff to kind of match what deadmau5 sounded like. It sounded like the mid or the lower part of that reverb was a little bit wider, while the highs were a little bit narrower. So when the plucks hit, we're getting this massive like reverb splash. So that is it for the plucks. We can go over the Reese next. And that sounds like this. So pretty Reese-y. It just follows, like, actually, these are the notes for the bass. The bass pluck follows the same thing. So I will take off the processing that I have and we can go through it. So I started with a saw wave and I threw it up to 5 voices. I've been feeling like lower voices on unison sounds lately. I just think it sounds a little better. So already it's sounding pretty Reese. Another cool thing to do is I duplicated that oscillator. I had it on 2 voices this time, detune a little bit lower. But if you play with the fine tuning, so it's not completely in sync, what that does is create some more phasing because this oscillator is just slightly faster than this oscillator, even though they're at the same octave. So if I take this down to 0, sounds like this. But if I start moving it up, you can hear it. So I did that to add some extra Reese character to it. Found that 44 was pretty good. I'm also LFOing the fine tuning just a slight touch, very slowly. So it's going just up and down a little slowly. So each note is a little different phasing. I think it just sounds a little bit more natural. The next thing I did, and this is how I got that very crunchy high end, is I'm actually using a notch filter to take out some of the highs. So if I show you on this EQ, basically what this notch filter does is something like this. So it's just completely taking out part of the frequency spectrum. So I'm doing that here around 2K, and that's taking out some of that nasally high end. So we're just left with that very crunchy high end. So without it, it sounds like this. And then with it. So that just sounds more buzzy. And then we can bring that back up or emphasize that with some distortion. So that's what I did next. Some tube distortion, just threw it like all the way up. So if I turn this filter off, it's just emphasizing the frequencies that you want to hear. And then I'm OTTing it. So we're getting even more of that very high end kind of bite. And then what I did is actually rolled off some of that just to match what deadmau5 had. So it's not so bright, but it's still crunchy. This auto pan, I was just trying some weird thing where it's kind of going in between each ear at a slow rate. So I was just trying to kind of emphasize more of that Reese character. It's probably very subtle, but I think it kind of helps. This EQ, I'm just cutting out the very sub end of that in the sides. And then this Pro Q, I was trying to do some kind of like multi-band compression. So I took like each frequency area of the bass and I'm doing dynamic EQ. So just controlling each frequency area at a more surgical rate. So the harmonics are not jumping up and down too crazily. They're staying kind of where they're meant to stay. So when it comes time to mixing, it's kind of more of a level sound, even though it's a Reese, which would have a lot of movement normally. It's also controlling that high end. These are 2 filters, and it's just to take out the highs and bring things up slowly or take out the very lows. This utility, same thing. I think this was from the intro where it's, yeah, coming up at the very start. This compressor is just to manage the entire sound together. Limiter is another thing to do to maintain same levels across each note. And this fab filter limiter, I'm just using it to see the levels. So if I take this limiter off before, you can see like all of those up and down frequency marks, level marks, and then throw this limiter on. So we're getting more of a uniform level of the bass as a whole. But yeah, that is the entire Reese. So yeah, that combined with the plucks, we get this like very solid foundation with this very bright kind of distorted high end, and the plucks with the reverb just kind of fills out the space, gives us some atmosphere. And another cool thing about that second oscillator trick where you throw the fine tuning of it just a little bit up is the higher the note goes, the more rapid that phasing occurs. So if you hear like a drum and bass kind of neuro bass, that's kind of what's happening. So this note, it's lower, the phasing is a little slower. But when it jumps up to this higher like G note, I think it is, it's much faster. Much more noticeable. It's just another cool thing. And then these bass plucks sound like this. So 16th note, like bass plucks, essentially, just following the same bass pattern. So yeah, I can go through this sound. And for this one, I actually did 16 voices with this saw wave. And so that sounds like this. And I'm actually, each note has its own little MIDI note here. So I'm not doing like a triggered envelope there. So that sounds pretty good. That kind of gave me that high end that I needed. But I added this second oscillator, which is this distorted bass dropper. I think that's in codecs. No, analog. No, it's in the digital. Yeah. That's kind of giving us that same character as the Reese has, which is that very high-end buzz or sizzle, which I think was needed because when this bass plays, it's a low frequency sound, but there's this kind of high mid-range buzz that you hear in the mix that you have to have there, or it doesn't feel like the song flows properly. So I added that. It's at a lower level. Actually, never mind. It's the same level. But yeah, that's the foundation of the sound. And then this filter has this envelope 2 on it, and this is how we get the start of that pluck sound. Again, I'm using this secondary envelope, which is much faster, just a little bit to give it more of that instant attack. So just giving us that kind of like slap at the very start. Didn't use the distortion after all, but again, compressing it. And you can see the compressor jumping up and down. So this is more of a just managing the level overall. I wasn't trying to emphasize the attacks on this at all. And then I'm boosting some of that higher ends with this EQ to start getting more of that high-end presence. Yeah, I don't think this reverb is very subtle. I think I was trying to give it some space, but it's not very necessary, I don't think. Next thing I did is I added this max bass plugin, which is a waves plugin. And if you watch deadmau5 stream or his old streams, he uses this on basses a lot, and it really thickens out the bass and gives it some more foundation. It's just like, it gives it this like kind of between sub and bass thickness, or like this hum. It just adds some like beef to it, I think. And so it just gives your bass the ability to be a really reliable foundation for the song. This funky EQ, I'm just trying to emphasize this, like whatever harmonic this is, around like the third harmonic, I think. Just to get some of that low mid, low bass harmonic sound thickness in there. So it feels kind of more of a mid bass now. There's some mid presence there. Again, this filter is doing the same thing for different parts of the song, just filtering it in and out. This EQ, similar to the Reese, I'm kind of doing some dynamic EQ just to control some areas where the harmonics might be going up and down. And then I'm emphasizing the area that I thought was necessary to hear in the high end of the mix. So I think for basses to flow with the kick and then with the rest of the mix, they have to be able to match the kick in the low end, its presence in the low end, in various areas like low bass, sub bass, and like the low mids. And then you also have to have some sort of a high end going on that could be subtle, but at least your ear can pick up on it. So it kind of glues itself to the other high end elements of the mix. I think he did this because, like, I mean, you could have like less of a high end, but because there's such a huge reverb space going on, I think he needed to add some high end just so your ear could pick up that there was this bass rolling along with everything else, because it would have gotten kind of lost in everything if there was no high end at all. Then I'm doing some side EQ, taking out some of the lows, emphasizing the sides in that kind of high mid area that we were emphasizing. And that is pretty much it. I have all my basses and synths going to the synth and bass group, which is where the LFO is. And that's like the last step, is to find a shape that works with your kick. This is what I ended up with. And the reason there's this blueness over here is I'm messing with the phase, because when you have certain plugins on your tracks that are going into a bus, it will cause some plugin latency, which actually affects when the LFO tool is ducking things. So you can use the phase tool to find the right space, the right area where it should be ducking. So with the plucks themselves, But yeah, that is pretty much it. Just 3 sounds from the XYZ remake. There's also that cool like choir sound. I think he actually used like some choir samples. I just found like some weird wavetable that kind of sounded like a voice. But yeah, I hope this was helpful. I'm gonna try and do like 2 videos a month, like religiously if I can, and also some additional kind of like one-off videos for the Patreon. So the Patreon people actually get some like something for being a patron. Um, but yeah, so I hope this was good for you guys. Let me know if you want some other stuff. I'm working on some other remakes. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.